just have to agree to it. All right, so welcome to the rekindling of the Unschooling School Cafe. Unschooling School is a group of people and a concept that kind of came together in the earlier days of the pandemic around the idea of how can we unschool, meaning drive our own education, in a school context, if that is where it makes sense for the child or teen to be at that moment. So we have a website with tons of resources that you might find something in there that's helpful to you. The group itself spent a lot of time discussing all of this and pulling together the website resources over the course of the pandemic. The members of the group are more sort of scattered to the wind working on our own projects at the moment. But there was an agreement that this cafe that we ran for a year and a half quite regularly provided a real benefit to the people who came. And so we decided to get this started again. It will be happening every 2 weeks, second and fourth Tuesday of the month at noon Eastern time. And it varies so much from week to week. You'll have people from all over the world. Sometimes it may not be from one city. Topics will be different. You just never know. It might be 2 people one week and 20 people the next. So I'm hosting the cafe. I'm Stephanie Sewell, and many of you know me. My bag outside of Unschooling School is that I'm an alternative education consultant. And what that means is that I help families to figure out what it looks like when education the conventional way is not working, or even when homeschooling the conventional way is not feeling like a good fit. I help them to understand different possibilities. And often that means understanding the idea of unschooling or self-directed learning, so that we start to realize that education can be driven by the child and the teen and the family rather than by the system. So that's kind of my thing. I work in groups. I mentor teens regularly on a one-on-one basis. And I do a lot of consulting with the families, with the parents, and just to help everybody pull it all together. So this particular topic was born out of a post in the Unschooling School Facebook page this week. Somebody saying, I am what Lara termed a reluctant homeschooler. I never wanted to be a homeschooler. I don't know how to be a homeschooler. I don't even know if I want to spend that much time with my child at the moment. And I'm not putting all these words into the mouth of the poster. These are just some of the things that I hear. Sometimes people come into homeschooling and it's been a lifelong dream of the parent to homeschool. And other times, and that's what we're focusing on right now, it happens because the child is dealing with massive anxiety in school and they literally can't go anymore. I'm really disturbed by the number of stories I've been hearing lately about parents who arrive at school with their child and their child is hanging onto the door frame of the car, begging not to be made to get out of the car. That's the disconnect that some people are having with school. And so, of course, those are families that find themselves having to explore homeschooling, unschooling, because school is just not an option. Nobody's going to take their kid and pull their fingers off the door frame to get them inside a building. So this idea of being a reluctant homeschooler, you find yourself in a position where suddenly you're responsible for your child's education. You don't have 5 days a week, 6 to 8 hours a day of time away from your child, and you feel completely lost and overwhelmed. And that's kind of where today's topic is coming from. So what I want to do is throw out a couple of ideas to kind of get us started, and then I'll open up the floor to Lara if she'd like to jump in. And Lara, I'm not sure if you can stay for the whole time or not, or if that works out for you, but we'll just make sure to hear from you and then whatever works for you beyond that. So one of the things that I talked about in the description for this is how to make a positive transition from being at school to school really not working to needing to not be at school anymore. And I think one of the really key things that I want to highlight there is the language that we use around it all. The only words that we usually have for leaving school, especially when we're talking about teens, is dropping out. And dropping out carries so much negativity with it. There's just nothing positive about the idea of dropping out. So one of the first things that I invite teens to do is think of another way of describing this. And it has to do with that idea of, okay, you're deciding that that's not working for you. So instead of doing what the system is offering, you're going to start doing what you want to. So we start looking at things like being a self-directed learner, choosing to step aside from school, rising out of school, all kinds of phrases that are floating around. And it really becomes a question of finding the phrase that works for you to give a positive shift to what needs to happen. So if you're looking at a younger child, we don't usually talk about kids in grade 4 dropping out. So it's a different set of language that we might need to shift. And then it can be even just the verbs that we use, like, oh yeah, we're having to start homeschooling. And it might feel absolutely like that, but even just consciously choosing to say, we're exploring homeschooling as an option, can just do that shift that allows you to start feeling some tiny bit better about it. And once you shift away that really tiny core shift to being positive, that can start to allow other things to come. So language. Another phrase or another sort of specific thing that will come out is the frustration that parents, kids, teens can have when they feel like there's no school out there for them. You know, how come so many people go to school and they love it and they're happy and there's no school that works for me? What's wrong with me? Or it's not fair. Why isn't there a school for me? So I think that's, welcome, Mindy. Glad to see you here. So I think when we're getting that kind of idea, again, it can be, how do you reframe that to think about, well, what is school? And we don't have to go through the whole history of school, but basically school was created for a purpose. You know, it was a general purpose for helping lots of people to wind up doing a specific thing. But school is really just the idea of where do you and how do you learn stuff that you need and want to learn to kind of live well in this world that we live in. So if we can change the idea of what is school and start using words around that, then that can help as well when you're feeling like there's no school that fits you. So instead of it being there's no school that fits me, this is an opportunity to realize that I get to make these choices and go out and find either what's going to work for me in a combination that I can come up with, or start creating some of what works for me and then blending that with other stuff that's out there. And part of that, of course, is recognizing that school doesn't have to be a one-stop shop. School can actually look like going on a shopping road in some little village where all the shops are owned by individual people, and you're going in and out of different shops, making contact with the owner, seeing the products that were handmade, and experiencing it as a real like a small local business experience instead of going to Walmart. So that's another way of looking at it. You know, we're used to thinking that we should be able to go to one building to get our education. But what if we say, yeah, that building's kind of like Walmart, and Walmart has some good stuff to it, but it's also really interesting to go into individually owned businesses. And maybe that's what education is going to look like for a while. So that's another way of just reframing. And then the last thing that I want to say as a way of introduction to all of this is the notion of potentially returning to school as being something to hold on to when you find yourself as a reluctant homeschooler. And that doesn't mean like, okay, we're just going to do this for a year and then it's going to all be done and we're going to go back to school. But what it does mean is that once we start to own our learning and we are making conscious and intentional choices around what we do, we might decide to go to school at some point. And somebody might have hated school, and school might have been very detrimental to their well-being. And a year or 2 or 3 years later, that same school context might actually work really well for them because they're a different person. They're coming at it from a different place. They've chosen to be there, instead of feeling that they have no choice to be. So as you're feeling and working through the overwhelm, that's a useful thing just to keep in the back of your mind, the idea that often it's just a question of taking some time away. And that can be the language that helps as well. Instead of like, we're not doing school anymore, we're taking a gap year, we're taking a break, we're taking a sabbatical. Who knows what's going to happen? We're just breathing. So to be in the moment, and for you as the parent to know that one possible outcome is going back to school, or as I see often, your kid is so like pumped with doing their own thing, they find their own way. They don't need to worry about school anymore because they've just found another one or some combination. Okay, so those are my thoughts based on the topic and the kind of points that I had said that we could talk about. I had the brilliant inspiration to invite Lara at about 10 to 12. I suddenly thought, because Lara is somebody who definitely found herself as a reluctant homeschooler a few years ago. And she and I have talked a lot about what that is. What does it mean when you go to the homeschool events and like everybody else is like, oh, we're homeschooling, and you're like, I just really don't want to be here. And how do you manage that feeling and so all of that? Lara, I'm going to let you jump in. Are you comfortable with me continuing to record while you talk at this point?
Yeah, sure.
So and just share whatever feels appropriate to you to share given what I've said. And then if you're able to stick around afterwards, then I know that people will pop in and people will share where they're at, and you'll be able to share some thoughts for that as well.
Hang on. Okay, I had a frog in my throat. Yeah, I definitely was a reluctant homeschooler, and it was simply out of a matter of necessity that school wasn't working. So my kid started having some school avoidance like in kindergarten, right? Like all the way back at the beginning, stomach aches when it was time to go to school, and it got progressively worse. And by grade 6, we were done with anything that was a semblance of it working. And I think I met you, Stephanie, at the very end of grade 6 after we'd tried our first sort of go at an alternative program, but that program didn't end up sticking around. And then the following year, we ended up working quite a bit with Stephanie just to help us figure out what our options were, because, and I definitely did say, my intention was never to homeschool for a variety of reasons. One, like I don't have the patience to sit down and teach my kid curriculum at the kitchen table, which is what I thought homeschooling was at the time, right? That was the only thing I thought it was at the time, was now we sit down and all the things you would have done at school, I must teach them to you. And we are going to sit at the table and fight all day long. That is what, right? While I try to do my job, like that's what it felt like the only alternative was. And I soon found out there were other options. But when I went into a lot of the homeschooling groups, it was a lot of like, a lot of people choose to homeschool as part of like creating community. It's like a lifestyle, right? It's a thing that they desire in this very special connected way. Not that I don't want to be connected to people, but it wasn't what I was planning for. It wasn't what I was interested in. I'm still working. How do I make it work? So learning about the idea of unschooling, deschooling, letting my kid have ownership over what he desired and what worked for him and how different that is for me. Like, I think I had an advantage when it came to accepting homeschooling because I hated school, right? I hated it my whole life. I got through it, but had I been given the opportunity to do some of the things I've learned about since entering on this journey, I've been like, I would have picked that. That being said, those things that I would have picked aren't the things that he would pick. And so understanding that there's like just this big variety of ways we can do things, and allowing ourselves to be different has been the biggest game changer. I don't know, Stephanie, what you were thinking of in terms of like where we're at now. Is that kind of what you were hoping? So we're on year 5 of all of this, right? He's in the equivalent of grade 11 now. Over the years, we've tried a couple of different programs. He's gone into school. He's done a program through the school board that was an alternative program when he was in grade 8, which went relatively well. But then the pandemic hit, and reintegrating back into school was not a thing that was going to work. Stephanie worked with him one-on-one quite a bit, and I would say that was one of the biggest things that worked, just that he felt really comfortable with her, and she was good at helping him articulate his own desires in a way that, just because I'm his mom, he can't seem to do with me. I'm really good at doing it, right? As a living, I do this kind of stuff for other people. It was like a complete no-go for me to do it with my own kid. So having somebody external to just be a safe space was really huge. He did a couple of online courses. He just sort of let himself de-school and tried to figure things out. And then this year he has started in the alternative high school that is in the closest to our house. And that was him. Like, he was wanting to be with people again, right? He was getting lonely. There wasn't enough social interaction for him. And so he desired to be around other people his age. And so we went and checked out the school, and the flexibility of that school made him willing to go for it. And he, like today, he didn't go. And I've learned to not stress over it that way, because he's also getting himself there pretty regularly under his own steam now. And like, that was unimaginable a couple of years ago. And so for me, the biggest thing was letting go of like the timeline of what school is supposed to look like. Doesn't matter if he doesn't graduate at the same time. I mean, truth be told, even when I was in university and college, that many years ago now, I wasn't there because I really wanted to be the first time. I had to go back to school, 5 years later, when I had finally actually figured out what I wanted. And there's no reason for it to be like, go, 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 go into the next step. So having let go of that specific timeline of you're supposed to graduate at 18, 17, I don't even know how old you are when you graduate now. And just leaning into like, let's figure out how to make you feel good about what you're learning, why you're learning it, and go from there. I don't know. Anything else, Stephanie, that you want to ask me so that I think of what else to say? Because you're muted though. You're muted, Stephanie.
Sorry. So I think you've covered most of it. Hi, Jerry, good to see you. And what I would say would be really interesting to add into that is all that time that he was like in his bedroom gaming, and how you as a mom felt, and how you feel now that he's not only in his room gaming, how you maybe address that kind of piece as well.
I mean, it was really hard to feel like we weren't just abandoning him to be sad and depressed, and finding sort of the balance of getting him out, and because he does do better when he's not just by himself all the time, but it is his natural inclination to sort of seclude himself. So there's like a combination of finding all the things that are really great about the fact that he was gaming, connecting with people, learning things, right? Stephanie's really good at being like, let's figure out all the things he's learning by doing the things that he's doing, even if it's not what you expected him to. But again, I worried about him being lonely, and I think he figured out that he was too. And so getting out of his room and doing other things is important, but it's a balance, right? It's still not, my expectation right now is not that he be out of the house 9 to 5, 5 days a week either. Like, that's still way beyond his capacity. But it's so much better than it was.
It's interesting the way you're describing it. It sounds like if you had to kind of explained it quickly. It's maybe the sense that he was allowed to have all that time to be in his room and kind of actually experience that loneliness that allowed him to also then find what it took inside him to decide to go and try the school again.
I
Is
think
that
part of
fair?
it is also just finding the right programs, right? This program that he's in now, he wasn't eligible for until he was
Yeah.
16. Although if you're in Ontario or Ottawa, it turns out they'll let a lot of kids in at 15 if you ask them to. So that is a thing I wish I'd known last year, because I think it's just finding the right things, right? It's
Yeah.
finding the things that, like, the idea of full-time school was so much for him. And when we tried last year, we tried regular high school last year, but like they weren't flexible enough for us to be able to make it work. If they had said, well, you do one or two credits at the, but come on in and still be with other kids, that might have worked better. But they weren't flexible enough. And he truly has difficulties with stamina to be in school all day for various reasons, including medical. And so like that on all day. And then he's got like his profile, right? So he's got ADHD, anxiety, and he's gifted. So you put all those things together and he's just like this big ball of stress all the time. Like, this is so boring that I can't even pay attention. So now I'm super anxious that I'm not going to do well, because I should do well because I'm really smart, but also I can't pay attention because this is terrible. So, right, like constant, like a snowball of unhappiness being sitting listening to teachers. I remember with one teacher, he was just like, he talks so slowly. And I was like, for him, it's just that processing of it, like, get on with it, right? And then it was so slow, he didn't know what he was talking about anymore.
It's so key, this need for flexibility. It's, if we could just have more flexibility, more options, so many of you wouldn't even be on this call, right? Like, okay, thank you, Laura. I really, really appreciate you sharing your story. And I know Karen mentioned that in the chat as well. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording and we can just go into like, throw out your ideas and where you're at and laugh and cry and all of that. So yeah, Derry just said he dropped in for a couple of minutes, and Derry is also a member of the Unschooling School team. He's in the UK, and both Derry and Richard have run very alternative programs within public schools. So have that experience, and neither of them is a spring chicken. So we know that these programs were run some time ago, and yet we're still not providing them systematically for kids. So know that the models are out there of how to do this in a way that works really well. And we've had kids who've gone through alternative options within and without school who are now well into their adulthood and thriving. So, when you have that part of the overwhelm and the anxiety that's like, my kid's going to be a disaster, it is possible to go and find proof that your kid is not going to be a disaster because they're educating in a different way. All right, so I'm going to turn off the recording and invite